King George VI, the reluctant king who never expected to rule. Thrust onto the throne in the wake of scandal, he inherited a nation on the brink of war, change, and uncertainty.
He was reserved, he was anxious, he was shy, he was dutiful, he upheld a sense of responsibility.
He was a king who was getting involved in a way that very few of his predecessors ever had. He was actually being asked by military leaders both from Britain and America, what do you think we should do?
A man plagued by self-doubt, yet destined to lead Britain through one of its darkest chapters.
When we think of George VI now, we think of a king who put duty and service ahead of all else. That was how he had biographers write about him during his lifetime, and it was the way that the biographers have written about him since his lifetime.
As bombs rained down and the proud empire began to slip away, he stood firm, a symbol of resilience in an age of turmoil. But what is the true legacy of King George VI? A reluctant hero who saved the monarchy? Or a man overshadowed by the world he left behind?
Yes, 1936, the year of three kings, was pretty epic for the British public. But I think that what was different then was there was such a reverence for the monarchy that they trusted that whomever was on the throne was going to give them the stability they needed. So the transition from George V to Edward VIII, that was natural. Although they were desperately sad by the death, I think everybody was excited in a sense to have this glamorous new young king.
December 1936. Britain is thrown into a crisis. The world watches as King Edward VIII, a monarch who has barely warmed the throne, make an unprecedented decision. He will abdicate for love. His desire to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, directly clashes with the expectations of the British monarchy and the Church of England. But as Edward steps away, the burden of the crown falls onto the shoulders of an unexpected successor, his younger brother, a man who had spent his life in the shadow of his elder sibling with no intention of ruling. With those words, the fate of the monarchy changed forever. Albert, affectionately referred to as Bertie, the Duke of York, is now King George VI.
Bertie would take the name George VI specifically in order to associate himself with his father, who had been George V. The connection there in terms of the public image was key. He saw himself very much of a king in the vein of his father, in terms of the values he sought to exemplify as monarch. He was about duty, diligence, behaving constitutionally, in contrast with his brother, Edward. It was also the case, of course, that Bertie, the name deriving from Albert, it's a very German-sounding name. Really, since the end of the First World War, the British royal family had sought to de-Germanize themselves and cut themselves off from their Germanic roots, presenting themselves as a more British family.
But there's a problem. The new king is no natural ruler. He is soft-spoken, shy, and worst of all, he has a stammer, a condition that, in the age of radio and public speeches, could shake the public's confidence in their leader.
Bertie had suffered from a stammer from childhood, but it was massively worse and exacerbated by his responsibilities when he reached adulthood, because he would have to give speeches, he'd have to give public appearances. And he hated it. He hated it because he felt completely ill-equipped to do so. And he would actively try and avoid opportunities of doing so because he felt embarrassed. The problem is that what he realised, especially when his father was alive, was that you can't duck these responsibilities. And so he had these horrendously embarrassing experiences that he would go and address for kind of low-grade events that you needed a member of the royal family to be at. And he'd often find himself making noise rather than a conventional speech, which is why he needed to have a speech therapist who could actually help him. So the speech therapist that he hired, or rather was hired for him by his wife, was this man called Lionel Logue, who was not Australian. And Logue was very unconventional because he didn't believe that the way of dealing with speech therapy was to be formal about it. He dealt with the king, who he called Bertie informally, as if they were friends, as if they were working on the same level. And the film The King's Speech offered a fictionalised account of this, and it's broadly accurate in what it suggests, that there was this friendship that arose between them. I mean, where the film sentimentalises matters is that George was afflicted by the stammer all his life and never went away. I mean, he was able at a push to do speeches without obvious sounds of impediment, but he needed speech therapy. He needed to be given, he needed to be bucked up, in other words, before he could actually do what he needed to do.
Yet, despite his reluctance, there was never a choice. The monarchy needed stability. The government, under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, had to restore faith in the institution. And so begins the reign of a man who never wanted to be king. September 3rd, 1939. Britain is at war. Again. Adolf Hitler's Germany has set the world on fire. The British people look to their leaders for guidance, for reassurance, and standing before them is a king who just 3 years earlier never expected to wear the crown. King George VI, the reluctant monarch, must now become a wartime leader. It is one of the most defining moments of his reign. Speaking to the nation over the radio, George VI addresses his people.
To God, with one and all, listen, and resolutely, faithful, commit, and ready to whatever service, or sacrifice it may demand. And then, with God's help,
The speech is heard across Britain, in homes, in factories, in the trenches. The king is no longer just a figurehead. He is a leader. But leading a nation at war is no simple task. With Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement failing and Britain on the back foot, the burden of wartime leadership falls on a new man, Winston Churchill.
When Churchill became Prime Minister, there was a real sense that Churchill was ungovernable. He would not listen to the king. He would tell the king what was going to happen. And George VI also had distrust for Churchill because he'd been so strongly on his brother's side during the abdication crisis. And he was saying, I cannot regard Winston as being my Prime Minister. I regard this as something that I can't get used to. But what happened over the course of World War II was that this relationship sprung up between them, which went from being, I think, a mutual animosity to, first of all, a kind of grudging respect, and then later a friendship. And what's very interesting is you can see again in George's life the quasi-paternal relationship arising. I think it gets to its most interesting point. First of all, towards the end, just before D-Day, that both Churchill and the king wanted to be on the troop boats landing in Normandy. And the king realised quite quickly that he couldn't, because obviously had he been killed it would have been catastrophic. But Churchill, up till a couple of days before the landing, was all set to do so. And the king wrote him these letters in which he said, if you were to die, it would be a personal loss as well as the loss of my Prime Minister. And so you can see these quite emotive ways in which the two would write to one another.
The king and Churchill became close, often meeting privately, sharing war strategies and anxieties. It is said that Churchill would even bow before the king, a rare sight from the proud and defiant Prime Minister. Meanwhile, the war rages on. The Blitz begins. Night after night, the skies above London burn as German bombs rain down on the city. Buckingham Palace itself is hit multiple times. One morning, the King and Queen stand amidst the rubble of their home. Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, famously declares, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face."
Of course, when World War II broke out and London was bombed and the royal family did not leave Buckingham Palace and everyone saw that the palace had been bombed and they went to visit the East End, that was incredibly clever and also incredibly soothing for the British public. So it stopped that them and us divide. Suddenly it's not them and us, it's they are one of us. And George grew into his role as his popularity was cemented at this time.
For many, this moment defines the monarchy's role in the war. George VI and his family refuse to flee to safety in Canada. They remain in Britain, standing side by side with their people. And through it all, George VI remains a steady, reassuring presence.
At the start of the war, there was a real concern at the palace that the British monarchy didn't really have a role to play in this war, that it could offer leadership by visiting troops, for example, but that it didn't really have a stage to perform on, as had been the case during the First World War. So then in the summer of 1940, as the bombing raids on London begin and the German Luftwaffe is blitzing people's homes, factories, and other towns and cities across the country, this, if you like, is the great opportunity for the British royal family, because suddenly they have a role to play. They go out visiting members of the public who have been bombed out of their homes, who have been working through the night to help those who are suffering as a result of the air raids. And the King and Queen see their roles as something of morale boosters. They are there to provide reassurance to the public, to recognise the hard work and effort that is going in to fighting this war on the home front. So it's a different kind of leadership to the wars of before, in that George and his wife Elizabeth's roles were much more focused on Britain and the home front.
D-Day, June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord is underway. It is the beginning of the end for Hitler's Germany. 10 months later, the war in Europe is over. On May 8, 1945, VE Day. Britain erupts in celebration. The streets of London flood with cheering crowds. The King and Queen step onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The war is over. The battle is won. Victory had been secured. But peace brought no relief. Only a new set of challenges. Britain, once the world's greatest empire, was battered, exhausted, and teetering on the edge of financial collapse. The country that King George VI had fought so hard to protect was now unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, industries struggled to recover, and the people who had endured years of rationing and sacrifice found that their suffering was far from over.
George VI, who had, as a young man, often suffered from ill health, became quite ill as a result of the Second World War. The stress of the conflict told on him. He was a heavy smoker, and by 1945, his health was actually very poor. In the ensuing years, that health would deteriorate. A number of smoking-related diseases would afflict the king, to the extent where he would ultimately die prematurely in 1952.
For the king, the war had been a test of leadership. The post-war years would be a test of survival. Britain was now facing an identity crisis. The war had made it clear that the days of imperial rule were numbered. The empire, once vast and powerful, was beginning to slip away. The first great blow came in 1947 with the independence of India and Pakistan. For centuries, India had been the crown jewel of the British Empire. But after years of nationalist movements, political unrest, and the financial strain of war, Britain could no longer maintain control. On August 15, 1947, India and Pakistan officially became independent nations. King George VI, once Emperor of India, had now lost his most prized dominion.
After the Second World War, there's a key transition in terms of empire. The empire is very rapidly becoming the Commonwealth. A key moment of change involving the king is when he no longer is Emperor of India, but is instead King of India and King of Pakistan, because British India gains its independence in 1947, split up into two new countries. Another key moment of change for King George VI is with the London Declaration of 1949, where he is given the title Head of the Commonwealth. So whereas he was once an emperor, he now has this more diffuse title, this less well-defined title, but nevertheless it's a key symbolic role at the heart of this new thing we call Commonwealth.
The empire was beginning to unravel. At home, the British people were demanding change. The war had exposed deep inequalities in society. Soldiers returning from the front lines wanted more than just gratitude. They wanted a better future. And in the 1945 general election, the people made their voices heard. Winston Churchill, the wartime hero, was voted out of office. In his place, the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, promised a new era of social reform. In 1948, they introduced one of the most significant policies in British history: the creation of the National Health Service. Free health care for all, a radical idea at the time, would change the fabric of British society forever. The monarchy, once a symbol of imperial rule, now had to redefine its role in a changing world. King George VI, a man who had once struggled to speak to his people, had become a steady and reassuring presence. But the strain of war, of duty, and of personal sacrifice had taken its toll. By the early 1950s, the king's health was rapidly deteriorating. Years of excessive smoking, drinking, and the stresses brought on by duty during the war had all but put the final nail in his coffin. His reign was nearing its end. But even in this weakened state, he continued to serve, because for King George VI, duty always came first. As the 1950s dawned, the weight of a tumultuous reign finally began to take its toll. King George VI, who had faced so many crises, some of which seemed insurmountable, was now confronted with his greatest challenge yet: his own health. Years of smoking, the stress of wartime leadership, and the physical demands of his position had worn him down. By 1951, the king was a shadow of the man who had once stood so firm at the helm of a nation in peril. His doctors had long warned him of his declining health, but George VI had always pressed on, ever dutiful, ever resolute. His body was no longer able to keep up. What had once been a quiet, introverted king now faced the reality of his mortality. In early 1952, after a particularly difficult battle with his health, George VI was admitted to Buckingham Palace with what would be his final illness.
George's health rapidly declined through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s. He was aware that he was seriously ill. He'd had an operation to have his entire left lung removed as a result of diseases related to his heavy smoking. This illness did not abate. Against doctor's orders, he travelled to the airport in January 1952 to say farewell to his daughter Elizabeth and Philip before they left for their tour of East Africa. It would be the last time that he saw his daughter.
To many, he had been a symbol of strength, enduring and steady through the darkest years. But now, with the monarchy facing a new chapter, the world looked to the next generation. In Kenya, Princess Elizabeth, George VI's eldest daughter, was on a royal tour with her husband, Prince Philip. When news reached her of her father's death, she was just 25 years old. The weight of the crown would now fall on her shoulders, making her the new Queen Elizabeth II. It was a historic transition, one that marked the end of an era. The reign of King George VI had been one of survival, duty, and unexpected leadership. Yet in many ways, it was his death that cemented his place in history.
I think that the legacy of King George is so strong precisely because it's contrasted against the legacy of his brother. So Edward is seen as somebody who jettisoned the throne of England, and George is seen as somebody who didn't want it, who sat on it and did his very best on it and brought great stability to the country, and also had this secure, tight family that played out so well with the British people. But to his credit, Edward did have a sense of that and did allude to that in his abdication speech, that they were in very safe hands with his brother, who had the love of a dutiful and warm wife and had this sense of family and would be a better king as a result.
He was not just the king who held the monarchy together in wartime. He was also the monarch who, despite his personal struggles, had set the stage for a new future. And so, King George VI's legacy was passed on not only through the monarchy, but through the stability and resilience he inspired in his people. Britain would never be the same, but neither would the monarchy. For Elizabeth, as she ascended the throne, the shadow of her father loomed large. She would face challenges of her own, but it was George VI who had laid the groundwork for the monarchy's survival into a modern world.
I think that if King George's spirit had been watching for Platinum Jubilee celebrations, he would have looked at it. He would have found some of it quite surprising, some of it rather strange. But I think generally, first of all, he would have enjoyed them. Secondly, he would have looked at his daughter and what she's achieved in the last 70 years, and he would have thought, I'm very glad to see what she's done.
King George VI, the unexpected king, had navigated his way through one of the most difficult periods in British history. He had saved a monarchy on the brink and seen his empire begin to crumble. Through it all, he had remained a figure of strength, leading a nation that was forever changed by the hardships he faced. In his death, a new era began, one that would be defined by his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. But the monarchy that she inherited was the one he had built. His legacy endured in her and in the world he left behind. The war was over.